event, which is the last Sussex Development Lecture of this term, but more to the point, a really special event, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all to Gender Challenges, a conversation with Bina Agarwal. Now, Bina, I've worked out, I have known for near on exactly 30 years, which more or less spans, actually doesn't quite span, the length of time covered by this extraordinary set of books that we're launching and celebrating this evening. Bina over that time has been a friend, a colleague, and somebody I have personally admired enormously and followed avidly, and I know that I can say the same for many, many people in this room. She's been an enormous inspiration to all of us in her work in feminist economics, gender, development, environment, agriculture, and more. And so I was absolutely overwhelmed with delight when she expressed the wish to give one of the launch sessions that she will be having about this extraordinary set of volumes here at IDS. And it feels very appropriate because there's a relationship that goes back a long way with IDS and Sussex. So Bina Agarwal is currently Professor of Development Economics and Environment at the University of Manchester in the UK. But she still spends a lot of her time in India, and prior to her Manchester position, she was Director and Professor of Economics at the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi. She has, over the decades, authored an enormous number, I think it amounts to more than 80, articles, most of which have been seminal articles, in the field of gender and development, of agriculture and environment. And I think it's testimony to her standing in the field that Oxford University Press were pleased to bring together the collection that we're launching this evening, which is sitting here beautifully in a lovely box, and I was complimenting Bina on the design as well as the content, because it's a fabulous collection. Bina also is a huge international figure. She's served on an enormous number of UN committees, the Committee for Development Policy, UNRIST. Recently, she and I have been together on the Science Committee for Future Earth and the International Policy of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. She's also led the Society for Ecological Economics over many years. And she's also received, very recently, a number of extraordinary awards. So in 2008, she was awarded a Padma Shri by the President of India. But just this year, she was elected a member in Italy of the Accademia Nazionale delle Scienze, which is only the second Indian to be so elected. And this very January, she was awarded an Order of Agricultural Merit by the French government. So this is somebody who's acclaimed throughout the world, and rightly so. So this evening, we're going to start by hearing from Bina something of the content and the substance and I think the inspiration behind this collection. And then we're going to have a conversation. And I'm going to start by exploring with Bina in a little bit more depth some themes in the volumes. And then John Thompson, who is a senior fellow here at IDS in our Rural Futures Cluster and leader of the Future Agricultures Consortium, is going to explore some other themes. So we'll have some conversation, and then we'll open up to all of you for Q&A with Bina. So without further ado, Bina, over to you.
Melissa, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And it's really wonderful to be here with so many old friends and colleagues. I've just seen Robert Chambers walk in, and there's Michael Lipton, there's Andrew Barnett, Rafika Kaplinski, and Anu Joshi. There's so many people and friends here. And I'm really, really moved that you could come. So thank you for coming. I'm honored that IDS Sussex has organized this event around my 3 volumes. And I'm really grateful to Melissa for the invitation, and I must thank Sophie Robinson, who did a lot of the background organizational inputs. Now, I've known, as Melissa said, I've known Melissa for really ever, as a wonderful colleague, as a friend, and now as IDS's first and most effective woman director. And just last night she was telling me of the amazing link that she and her colleagues have made between the use of research for guiding action, especially in the Ebola crisis and in many other, which forms a really good blueprint for this sort of intervention of research for making ground practice more effective. I also knew Melissa's father at one point, so I'm very pleased to be here. Actually, for me, coming to IDS is really like coming home, because the years I spent here, I was first a fellow at the IDS, and then I was a research fellow at SPRU, and this was in the late 1970s, early 80s, and they were both years which were hugely productive, but also made lifelong friends. And some of the papers in volume 1 of the compendium were actually written here, either in full or in draft. I've been back a few times since, including when my father was an IDS fellow here in 1990. So I'm privileged that Melissa and John will engage with my work, and I very much look forward to their comments. So what I'm going to do, you can all hear me, right? Yes? Okay. I will briefly give you some highlights of the volumes before we start the conversation. Now, all 3 volumes relate to the rural economy, to the fields, the forests, the technologies that people use, and the families, the communities, and the state institutions in which they function. Now, the essays use a gender lens to challenge mainstream thinking in the social sciences and to suggest both theoretical and policy alternatives, because it seems to me that we do also need to think of alternatives. Now, in my work, I take a somewhat agnostic approach to gender analysis, because I believe we must question popular assumptions even about gender outcomes and test these assumptions against evidence. So I do that by using mixed methods. I use both quantitative and qualitative methods. I also believe it's very important to work across disciplines and across countries, because the context of my work, therefore, is not just India, but often it is many countries in Asia, and occasionally, comparatively, with Africa and Latin America. So let me begin by giving you first the flavor of some of the central ideas in each volume. Volume 1 is titled Agriculture, Technology and Food Security. I'm just trying to get this to move. There was that other keyboard. Okay, excellent. So this just gives you a bit of a view of volume 1, and it covers my work from 1981 to the present. It's a very long time. In fact, the first chapter in volume 1 on women and technological change in agriculture, the Asian and African experience, was written at IDS. Now, the volume begins when the Green Revolution in agriculture was at its height, and we know today that we face a very different scenario of falling water tables, of degraded soils, of climate change disasters, and farmer suicides. But one thing that's common to both periods is the substantial invisibility of women farmers in analysis, in data, and in policies. Now, this is despite what we find and what I talk about in terms of the feminization of agriculture. So basically, because what you see happening is that more men than women move from agriculture to non-farm jobs. It may be in the rural areas itself or to the nearer towns and so on. So we see this globally, barring Northern Europe. I mean, there's a downward slope in Northern Europe, but there's an upward trend in all the other cases. There's an aggregate, the red thing is aggregate for Europe, but if you disaggregate, you'll find that Northern and Southern Europe is different. Now, in Asia, almost 40 to 50% of agricultural workers today are women. And I argue this in several papers, that our food security and farm output would depend increasingly on women farmers. Yet they have rather limited access to land, to inputs, to technological information, to credit, to irrigation, and to markets. Now, this clearly would reduce their productivity. However, according to the FAO's assessment in its 2011 State of Food and Agriculture report, in which it culls together a range of studies which have compared productivity on women's farms and men's farms, it assesses that if women farmers had the same access to inputs as men, the yields on their fields could rise by 20 to 30%, and agricultural growth in developing countries could be higher by 2.5 to 4%, depending on the country. Now, this potential remains largely untapped. We also find that women farmers are undercounted as workers, women in general. So their productive work at home, it could be cultivating family fields, cattle care, fetching fodder, firewood, home-based productive work, apart from basic domestic work, remains invisible, unpaid, and largely excluded from statistics. Now, there's a vibrant debate today in India and elsewhere globally of why Indian women have such low labor force participation rates. There's a paper I wrote which is in volume 1 in 1984, where I talk about the kinds of biases in defining work and the undercounting and underreporting by male enumerators and of respondents. And you find this not just in India, but in many countries, which means that a lot of their work, not just the care work, but a range of activities that they do tends not to be counted, and they're not counted as workers. So if we take a very narrow definition of work based on women's paid work, then rural women's work participation in India today is only 17.5%. This is by the NSSO 2011-12 data. But if we take a wider definition and we include productive work at home, self-employment, and declared unemployment, we get a work participation rate of 64.8%. So there's a huge difference. Now, many people also assume, and they particularly assumed many years ago, that women workers are less efficient than men. So when I was a doctoral student, I found that agricultural economists were counting women's labor as equivalent to half or three-quarters of male labor. Why? Because they were paid half or three-quarters of male labor. So what was discrimination in the labor market actually got converted into bias in academic work. And I was pretty disquieted by this. I said, this can't be right, but I needed evidence to counteract it. And I found it. So, in one of my field visits to the Punjab, which is northwest India, in the Punjab Agricultural University, a young engineer, he came up to me and said, look, here are the results of an experiment that I did using potato digging equipment, and I tested it on women workers and male workers. And this is what he found. And so as you can see, by whatever measure you take, women workers are more efficient than male workers. So for instance, you just look at this, hours taken for the same jobs. And so, of course, this gave me enough just to argue in my doctoral dissertation that at least we can count women workers as equivalent to male workers. And I did so, and it was the most discussed point in my Bible-verse. Have things changed today? Somewhat, but not entirely. Now, central theme in volume 1 is also the gender impact of technology and women's access to it. So I cover a range of technologies from high-yielding variety crops, mechanized equipment, and cooking stoves. So let me take the example of cooking stoves. Now, in the 1970s, again, as a doctoral student, when I was interviewing farmers in the Punjab, and that's India's most prosperous state, the men would take me and show me their tractors. And then I would go and sit with the women in the kitchen, and they would be cooking in open fires in very smoky stoves. And even today, many farmers' wives cook on old stoves with wood or other unprocessed biofuels. In fact, fuel wood is the single most important cooking fuel in rural South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And these figures are not this year's, but a few years ago. 65% of rural households in India, 90% in Nepal, use mainly firewood for cooking. Now, this has very serious health implications. So, if you look at this, a little hut and you see the women cooking. And if you see the figures, due to indoor air pollution causes acute respiratory infections and a whole range of other diseases, cataracts, cancer, and so on. And you find that due to indoor cooking smoke, because of the cooking smoke in developing countries, women's risk of mortality is 50% higher than men's. And women account for 60% of the 1.6 million deaths annually from this cause. Also, of course, several thousand infants die each year. So although we keep talking about air pollution in third world cities, this indoor air pollution from cooking is really much more lethal. Now, in the 1980s, both India and China launched programs for disseminating improved stoves and clean energy from biogas. But today, China has moved far ahead of India. I'll just give you a picture of old stoves, improved stoves, and biogas. China's moved hugely ahead of India, and it's an obvious question, well, why? Now, there are many reasons, some of which I've analyzed. But among other things, what's striking is the organizational structure of diffusion and the attempt to adapt the stove as an innovation for users' needs. Now, I discussed some of these issues in my 1983 World Development paper in Volume 1, in which I present a conceptual framework for understanding the diffusion process and the need to adapt innovations to user needs, and especially to women's needs for acceptance. So for instance, you actually have to explain to the user what's the function of a flue door, which regulates air, or what's the function of the chimney, because you found that women would just remove the chimney. And you ask them, well, why? Well, because they got rid of insects and mosquitoes in their thatch roofs. So they had a perfectly valid reason for that. But of course, it hadn't been explained to them that without the flue door and without the chimney, it was like any other stove. Now, so this paper is based on my work at SPRU, and it also led to my 1986 book, Cold Hearts and Barren Slopes, the Wood Fuel Crisis in the Third World. And I have to thank Andrew Barnett, who's sitting here, who actually inducted me into this research. It was a very exciting time to be at SPRU, because Chris Freeman, Martin Bell, Charles Cooper, and Andrew Barnett were all there, and they were all challenging existing theories of diffusion, especially those of Everett Rogers. I don't know if some of you might have come across that, but the focus then was in the literature that all you had to do was communicate to the user and persuade the user in order for them to adopt. And it took little account of the structural, financial, and social constraints that users might face, especially women, in adoption. So some of that work really looks at these sorts of constraints. In fact, women rarely have a say in the design of most equipment they use, and especially, of course, agricultural equipment, and rather few own that equipment in Asia and Africa. So I have some figures for Gambia, for instance, that less than 1% of women farmers were found to own a weeder, a seeder, or multi-use implement, relative to 12%, 27%, and 18%, respectively, of male farmers. I mean, it shows that male farmers also, lack equipment if you're not well off, but the gender difference is striking. So these and other inequalities stem especially from, I argue, women's unequal bargaining power within families and communities. And that's the subject, really, of one of my most cited papers, which is in Volume 2, which is Bargaining, and this is Chapter 4, Bargaining and Gender Relations within and beyond the household. Now, when I wrote that piece, there was an emerging critique. This is a 1997 paper, and there was an emerging critique of the unitary household model, especially as constructed by the Nobel laureate Gary Becker, which assumed very broadly that family members have common interests and preferences, that incomes are pooled, and an altruistic household head ensures equitable allocation of resources. Now, we all live in families, and we know that's just not the case. But apart from that, there's a growing literature. There was a huge growing literature on intra-household inequalities, that the intra-household allocations were very unequal, and it helped challenge every one of those assumptions. So what was the alternative? So there was an alternative which was being suggested, which is collective models of the household, bargaining models in particular. So when I came in, what I saw was, and I think the bargaining framework really provides us an entry point in understanding inequality in intra-household allocations. But what affects bargaining power? And much of that literature was only looking at income as the factor affecting bargaining power. What I argue is that bargaining power can depend on many factors, some of which are quantitative and some are qualitative. So for instance, among qualitative factors would be social norms, social perceptions, social support, and quantitative ones, for instance, could be employment, ownership of private property, and access to public property. So women typically have lower bargaining power than men on most of these counts, leading to gender unequal outcomes. Now, here's a diagram. Anyways, also this is a diagram in that paper that I told you about. And basically what I want to point out is that what I argue is that bargaining takes place simultaneously in 4 arenas: the household, the community, the market, and the state. And that if you change women's bargaining power in any of these arenas, it will have an impact on the other arena. So for instance, if you could persuade the state to transfer resources, whether it's cash transfers or it's land, to women, then so if the state is gender friendly, then it will lead to improving their bargaining power within the household. Or if you married a husband who was very supportive and looked after the kids and shared your housework, then it would hugely improve your bargaining power in the labor market, and so on. So this is an attempt to show interactive bargaining, and also in the center what I do is I talk about the various sorts of factors which could affect women's bargaining power, especially in relation to subsistence. But you could apply that to other contexts, bargaining with the state, and there's a paper there where I look at bargaining with the state, which came out as an IDS working paper, in fact, and I presented it at the conference, so it's in that. Now, one of the things I do emphasize is that one can take a range of factors which affect bargaining power, but one of the most important is women's ownership of property, and especially land, immovable property. So my volume 2 is therefore focused on the question of property, family, and the state. And one paper in particular I want to focus on at this point, that many papers in this volume argue how women having, especially because if you're looking at rural societies, land is very important, and women's access to land can have huge, or lack of access can have huge implications, not just for their own welfare, but also the children's welfare, and for social status and political voice. And there's quite a lot of literature now to show, especially at IFPRI, of Agnes Quissedvik, Lawrence Haddad, and many others who've shown that if women's assets matter, mothers' assets matter much more than fathers' assets in having positive outcomes for child survival, education, and health. However, what subsequent work that I did with a colleague showed it had a huge implication for domestic violence, the risk of domestic violence. So for instance, in chapter 6 of volume 2, I show that women who own a house or land are greatly protected from domestic violence. So what we did was we took 500 randomly selected households in Trivandrum district, rural and urban Trivandrum, in Kerala. And this is just a very simple table which shows that if women who owned neither house nor land, you see that the incidence of violence is as high as 49%. And if they own both, it's 7%. But even if they own one or the other, it's 18 and 10%. And then we regressed it by controlling for a vast number of other variables, including employment differences, education differences, childhood exposure to violence, and sort of so on and so forth. And we found that property ownership, immovable property ownership, made a huge difference. What was also interesting is that employment didn't provide the same protection. So if you look at this table, you find it's, so for instance, if you have employment but you're seasonal and irregular employment, you actually have very high incidence of domestic violence. So except for regular employment, you have very high levels of domestic violence. And especially if the woman is better employed than the husband, it has a perverse effect. The incidence increases. However, if there is a difference in property ownership, that the woman's own property and the husband does not, it still provides a substantial protection from domestic violence. So it sort of explains the many studies that you find which don't control for property, but actually only control for employment, to see that many of them do find that there either increases or decreases domestic violence. But when you look at property, it has the effect of protection. And it also sort of demonstrates that you need to move away from the idea of absolute capabilities that Amartya Sen talks about, to take into account relative capabilities to understand well-being outcomes. But studying women's rights and property in land was not easy, because in South Asia, most arable land is privately owned and few want to sell it. So inheritance is the main way of acquiring it. And this means that you have to understand the inheritance laws. So when I began my research in the 1980s, there was very little written on gender and land, even in law. And I was researching not just India, but 5 countries in South Asia. And I found that inheritance differed by religion, by region, and type of property. So if the inheritance rights, say, of a Hindu woman were different in North India, from South India, from Sri Lanka. And inheritance of land was even more complicated. So if you were, say, a Hindu woman in India, whether or not you inherited land depended on the state's land reform laws. And in 6 states, the land reform laws specified that women would not be able to inherit land except in the absence of 4 generations of men, which is of course part of the 12th century Dharma Shastra rules for male adults. But if you were a Hindu Nair woman in Kerala, which is in South India, all property passed through and to you. In fact, each state has its own land inheritance laws, so in relation to land. So to teach myself the laws, I spent many months in the Supreme Court Local Act Library in Delhi with millions of dusty files and twice as many mosquitoes. So I'm a survivor of falciparum malaria. So similarly, I studied Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Nepal, and I tried to trace the shift from customary laws to contemporary laws. And what is striking was the cultural commonalities, which were much more important than religion in defining women's traditional rights and property in South Asia. So if you look at Sri Lanka, it's so interesting that whether you take the majority Sinhalese or Buddhist, you take the Jaffna Tamils or Hindu, or you take the Muslims or matrilineal in the eastern province, all across they had strong traditional and historical rights in land. And they had much more in common with each other than their religious counterparts in other parts of South Asia. Now, what was of course difficult is that none of this paid work had been done by legal scholars, so I laboriously sort of tried to break new ground. And you might ask, well, was it worth it? And I believe it was, because it gave me enough understanding of the law to write many of the papers in volume 2. But it also helped me intervene effectively for helping to amend the Hindu inheritance law to make it gender equal in 2005. And it got me an invitation to teach law to JD and LLM students at the New York University School of Law. But knowing the law is not enough, and we know that. So how do you look at the gap between law and practice? And here it is absolutely necessary to turn to anthropology. So reading hundreds of ethnographies, unpublished doctoral dissertations, everything that you're going to produce in a few years, I read all of that I could lay my hands on, and they gave me so much insight. And luckily I was based at Harvard then, so I would just go to the Widener library, and they said, we order everything you need, but we have one rule. And that was, you can only order 4 dissertations in a week. That's pretty much microfiche. Now, very few of these writings that I read actually dealt with property per se, but they gave details of kinship and marriage, marriage patterns which impinge on these rights. So for instance, fathers are much more willing to give their daughters landed property where the social norms allow women to marry within the village and marry their cross cousins, that is across within the extended family. this is quite different. This is the pattern you find in South India and Sri Lanka, which is quite different from North India and Nepal, which insist on distant marriages. So this is both to reduce the dispersal of property and to bring it under control of. So these are just some maps. They are based, by the way, not because I just like to do some coloring one fine morning, but, they are based on literally dozens and dozens of ethnographies. And so if you looked at traditional, if you see this map, you see how South Indian states and Sri Lanka looks well. And village endogamy norms are that you're allowed to marry within the village and in all these regions. So there's this, and then I don't have a map here on cross-cousin marriages, but there's quite a close link between your ability to marry within the village and other marriage patterns and the implications for possibilities of inheriting land. Now, of course, as an economist, I also wanted data on what, well, you'll ask, well, what percentage of women own land? And it's very difficult to answer it because there's virtually, after all these years, there's so little information on gender disaggregation of property and asset ownership. Now, I've culled this together. Some of it is on the basis of census, like in Nepal, 14% of women own land. But in other cases, in India, you don't actually, this is culled on the basis of surveys, small surveys, sometimes large. So the figures for Ghana, 5% of registered landowners, 10%, Kenya, only 5% of registered landowners, and so on. Now, when I wrote that book, A Field of Unsown, and many of the papers in volume 2, almost no one was focusing on women's land rights. And today I'm really pleased that it has become a global goal. And in goal 5 of the Sustainable Development Goals, you find that this is one of the major ones. So, okay, then quickly to volume 3 of the compendium. This is on environmental change and collective action. Sustainable development and environmental governance, as you know, is one of this century's biggest challenges. So volume 3 tries to show why our solutions are going to be ineffective without a gender perspective. But we also have to be critical of certain types of gender analysis. So volume 3 begins with my 1992 critique of ecofeminism, which argues that women, irrespective of context or class, are closer to nature than men and are more knowledgeable about nature than men. As against this essentialist position, I develop what I call an alternative, which is feminist environmentalism. And I argue that women's and men's relationship with the natural environment depends on the material reality, on the specific forms of interaction with natural resources. So it matters what your class is, your caste, your ethnicity, your location, and your context all matter. So much of this volume therefore focuses on two aspects: women's exclusion from governance and then the impact of their inclusion. Now, India and Nepal were among the first of 50 countries to launch community forestry programs in the 1990s after recognizing that there's state failure. So let's try communities. And many of us had been arguing that this move would be a positive one. So in 1998-99, I traveled across India and Nepal for 6 months, just talking to communities. I talked to something like 96 villages. And the good news was that forests were improving everywhere. The bad news was that women were largely excluded from active participation. I call this participative exclusions, and it's in my World Development paper in volume 3. So here's a pictorial view of participatory exclusions. Can you spot the women? Yes? No? I'm sure you can spot them. It's color-coded. The red ones. They've got their heads covered, of course. And this is what they said. So what I did in 2001 is I said, well, let's turn this whole story of exclusion, let's turn it on its head and say, what if women were included? Would it really make a difference? And what is this, people were talking about this magic number, 1/3, a lot of lobbying around that. So I said, well, why 1/3? Let's test it out. So I did a primary survey in India and Nepal, and I tested for critical mass in terms of women attending meetings, holding leadership positions, speaking out. Now, you know, capturing a threshold effect is really not easy, because if you simply increase the number of women in a committee, it will increase the likelihood of more women attending, even if each woman's likelihood of attending is independent of every other woman's likelihood of attending. So to test this, I calculated what I call the attendance rate. And that is the average proportion of an executive committee women attending a meeting. Namely, the number of EC women attending a meeting divided by the number of EC women and averaging them by the number of meetings held in that group. So the basic argument is that if the attendance rate rises somewhat, it's sort of flat and then it rises, then it gives you an inflection point. And then after that it can level off. So, I mean, it's one of many results. I can't possibly put slides on all of them, but even the work was in Gujarat and Nepal, and you find that if it is 25 to 33%, you find that that's where the highest. Here it drops off after that, and here it levels off. And there's a whole range of regressions and so on I did. But this gives it nicely, because this is really the leadership, the probability of a woman holding office, which is becoming, within the group, becoming a president, vice president, treasurer. And you find that it's pretty flat here, and then it begins to come up. And of course it continues to increase, and you have, but that's roughly what you capture when you do the regressions as well. So 25 to 33%, despite my skepticism, what I found was a critical point. Now, most importantly, of course, for the environmentalists in this group, you'll say, well, okay, they're attending meetings, they're speaking up, well, so what? So what was that it made a huge difference to conservation outcomes. So for instance, I've given you two results. One is where you compare 2 women and less, groups with 2 women and less, and groups with more than 2 women. Typically, the executive committee was 11 to 15 persons. And you found that by every indicator virtually that I used for forest conservation, the results were significantly better when you had groups with more women. And in the case of Nepal, where I compared all women groups with mixed gender groups, the likelihood of improvement in forest canopy was 51% higher. I'll just give you a glimpse of the regression, but I won't bore you with it, but you can see that, you can see the marginal effects here, after controlling for a range of other factors. Okay, together these volumes seek to cover, I try and cover in this the most important resources and institutions around both private and common property that bear on gender inequality, and which could affect outcomes both for women and their families and for wider society. Now, in all 3 volumes, I also emphasize the importance of resource pooling, collective action to overcome this advantage. And one of the papers in volume 1, Agricultural Production Collectivities, also relates to my current work, where I'm looking at in depth where the farmers pooling their land and resources in India and France and Romania would make a difference to overall output. So finally, and I'll end with this. This is this is also the cover of my volume 1, but this is technology in women's hands, and this is a women's group farm in Kerala, which I've been studying, among others. So at the end of volume 3, by the time you've kind of plowed through, or don't plow through, just start with the end of volume 3, you'll find a brief afterword which seeks to identify what kinds of gender analysis can effectively challenge mainstream economics. And I hope that will elicit a debate. It's very much a set of propositions which you can engage with and agree or disagree with. And then very, very finally, I'll end with the Sustainable Development Goals, because the issues I raise in the 3 volumes relate closely to the SDGs. It's not just goal 5, which is gender equality, but as you can see, the interrelationship of, for instance, women owning land or property or other assets impinges also on poverty, no hunger, good health, and quality education for children in particular. And then, of course, there's reduced inequality. And then if you look at volume 3, then the question of protecting the planet comes in if women's inclusion in governance leads to better conservation outcomes. But if you were to ask me, And well, where would you put your finger on which particular goal if you were to just say one goal? Then I would put my finger on this one, because I believe it has the most synergy. They've diluted it a bit, I'm afraid. It says in accordance with national laws, because of course you have to change the laws in order to reach that goal. Okay, so why have I called this Gender Challenges, these volumes, rather than Gender Perspectives, for instance? Because I'm hoping that the papers in these volumes both challenge mainstream social sciences, but they also seek to pose challenges to ourselves as researchers and practitioners on how we might achieve gender equality. Because, as you know, there can be many pathways, and we still have to seek synergy for that. Thank you.
Bina, that was wonderful, and I think you've given us a fantastic flavour of what is in these volumes, and I would really encourage everybody to have a look. So John and I are now each going to have a few minutes to make some remarks and ask Bina some further questions in a conversational style about what's here. And I wanted just to start by saying that for me, having been a really avid reader of, I think probably most of these pieces at the times that they emerged, it's immensely exciting to have them all brought together in this set of volumes. And I think what having them all together really showcases is that what we have here in Bina's work is scholarship that combines a lot of things. On the one hand, it's really carefully grounded in really nuanced economics, but reaches out to other disciplines, I think, as we've seen in what Bina said. Interested in social factors, in anthropology and sociology, in innovation studies and what they can tell us. It's deeply feminist and committed to understanding women's perspectives, interests, roles, rights, but without collapsing into the stereotypes about women and girls that we see so often today passing for debates about gender. It links quantitative data with really nuanced interpretative analysis, and it manages to combine a focus on localities, reaching right within households, communities and so on, with a connection with regional and in some cases global processes of change. And I think finally what I've always appreciated about Bina's work, and I think it's something I've tried to emulate myself, is to bring detailed scholarship into interaction with mainstream debates in science and in policy, challenging them and sometimes overturning them wholesale. I mean, I think some of the work that you did around cold hearts and barren slopes, overturning dominant images about the fuelwood crisis, or indeed some of the mainstream debates about agricultural technology, which is simply turned upside down, is superb. So that's really where I wanted to start. So I'm going to pick up particularly on the third volume, so we're going to go back to front, because it's been Bina's work on sustainable development and environment that has had most direct relationship, I think, with my own interest. And look back to the 1990s and that paper you talked about when you overturned the myth of women's closeness to nature that cultural ecofeminists were putting forward at the time, drawing on mythical interpretations of Hindu mythology and indeed of certain movements, the Chipko movement, as somehow evidence of women's closeness to nature. And you offered us different interpretations and you put forward this feminist environmentalist view. At that time, in the early 1990s, of course, it was the heyday of the first round of concern with global environmental change, the Rio conference in '92, the discovery of women and environment somehow as an instrumental way of saving the planet. And I was one of those who was also part of the critique of those debates in some ways that I think were quite similar. So you've talked about the critique you offered then. I'd like to ask you, Bina, to reflect a bit on what you think is happening now, because I left some of those debates a bit, I think you also did. In 2014, colleagues and I here re-looked at gender environment literature as part of leading UN Women's World Survey on Economic Development, which had a focus on gender relations and environmental change in the run-up to the SDGs. And we found a lot of resurrection of those old narratives about women in nature and about somehow women being the sustainability saviours who were now going to save the planet. So, Bina, I'd like to ask you, in the world you occupy, which overlap with mine to some extent, but are also different, to what extent do you see a resurrection of those old figures that some of us thought we'd done away with? Why do you think that's happening, and what might we do about it now? I think I can just use this. It's green, just push it forward and if the red light's on, it's on.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a very good question. Because if you remember in 1992 at the Rio Plus, Maurice Strong took a very strongly eco-feminist view, and he said women should be asked to mother the earth. And so it really reflected the eco-feminist understanding. And I think people thought he was very pro-women. And I think this is the conundrum, that you hold women responsible for even my results, for instance. You'll say, well, women are doing so well in protecting the forest, and there are very positive outcomes, and if you have all women's groups, then you have a greater chance for improvement. So I think the narrative is, both narratives exist. You know, the narrative of ecofeminism, that women are important to be included, but the other, which is the more practical, that do you include them and do they have a say in management of resources? And I think the second is important, because we're not saying that women should not participate in protecting natural resources, for instance, or in conservation efforts. What you are saying is they also have to be empowered to have access to resources. And I think this is where I am so substantially different from the position of, say, Shiva and Maria Mies when they wrote their book on ecofeminism, because they were not asking for women to have access to resources. And I would imagine that one can take that position for many things, that yes, the women are farmers, that's fine, but then please give them access to land and access to inputs and credit and so on. So that would be the direction in which one would need to push the argument, don't you think?
No, I completely agree. And so when one sees arguments these days about women being the adapters to climate change, who are going to lead their communities in being more resilient, one has to make sure that they've got the power and resources to do it. Otherwise it becomes an instrumentalisation of women's labour, and in addition to their already long list of unpaid care roles, caring for the environment becomes an addition. So I think your focus on rights and power, frankly, is spot on. So there I wanted to turn to, of course, your work on gender and green governance, and the 2010 book and the papers that are in the volume about forest governance, which I found, frankly, one of the very best examples. I mean, we talk about inclusion of women being good for the environment and women's rights and control over resources being good for conservation. But there are remarkably few studies that have done what you've done and really linked social and environmental data. And actually shown, particularly, I think, the environmental governance context of this 30% ratio, where you've actually got data to show why that matters. But there's a bit of a conundrum, isn't there? Because as I read it, you started that work by going to many communities and finding that actually some of the existing top-down government rules about forestry, excluding people from those forests, were particularly bad for women, because women were relying on forest commons for fodder, for fuel wood, for food gathering, and so sometimes suffered from those rules. And yet, your data suggests that when women are involved, the rules work better, and somehow forests are protected. Could you say a little bit more about why it is that women are apparently going against their apparent material interests in enforcing rules better when they have the power to do so? What's going on there?
Okay, well, yeah, thank you. That's an interesting question. Several things. So, when you start protecting a community forest, you do two things. I mean, you set in place a set of rules of who can enter, who cannot enter, and who can extract from the forest, who cannot. and when can you extract from the forest. So for instance, women depend on forests in these communities for firewood, fodder, non-timber, various sorts of non-timber products. Men depend on them particularly for timber. Now, when you begin to protect, you are able to convert what is effectively an open access situation by telling other villagers around you that you cannot enter. And you do that by forming patrol groups. So you find that when women are included in these committees, I have a, not with me, but there's a lovely slide. We show these 4 women who are going on a round. And once I went with them on the round, and they showed me all the ways in which the men had not caught what had been actually stolen from the forest. So they feel, it's like if you are instrumental in making the rules, you're more likely to comply with the rules. And they say so explicitly. So once they exclude other villagers, the forest resource begins to improve. And there's more available for them in terms of extracting foreign fuel. So there is a degree of sacrifice involved, but they're able to see, of course, that the forest is degraded and it's giving them nothing now. So if you see it as a time trajectory, so it's better protection. Secondly, they bring their knowledge of forests to bear. So there is now a fair amount of evidence to show that both men and women know about different items in the forest. Women tend to know much more about firewood species, fodder species, how to extract. For instance, if you are in Nepal, you're extracting tree fodder, it's very important that you extract in a particular way so that you don't destroy the original resource. So they bring that knowledge to bear in the discussions and make suggestions. You can't capture all of this statistically in fine detail, but you can capture it if you're doing mixed methods and you're actually talking to them, and that's what comes out. Yes.
Fantastic, and I think another really good example of the way your work links economic data and quantitative data with this nuanced interpretive analysis that you can only get through mixed methods, through qualitative work. And I think in the forestry area, really salutary lessons for what we're now seeing, which is a new round of forest conservation in the interests of carbon and protecting forests in developing countries to offset the emissions of industrialized countries in the north, where we're seeing a new round of, frankly, fortress conservation schemes that are forgetting many of the lessons of community forestry, even those that are ungendered. So I think everybody designing a red scheme ought to read Gender and Green Governance and this volume as a matter of strict compulsory reading. So I've got one final question before I turn to John, and it relates to the SDGs. And it relates to, as it were, scaling up from what's going on in communities and what women are doing in communities to what they might do globally. Because I agree with you that Goal 5 around gender could be argued as a central goal to delivery of all the others, frankly. And I also feel that we need to see the SDGs as an integrated set, in the sense we've got a transformative agenda there for people and for planet. And we can't go about chopping up water and energy and so on into little silos. And actually gender equality is a linking theme across all of them. But a lot of this is global, moving down to national policies. Much of your work has shown the power of women's collective action and rights and control and decision making locally. Is there a way, or what would your work tell us about the prospects for connecting up local forms of action, local movements, networks perhaps, to begin to have influence nationally and globally to make sure that this hugely important SDG agenda, with gender at its heart, really has traction, and that this transformative agenda has some prospects of being delivered by 2030? That's a big question, but it's about scaling up, as it were, that sense of collectivity.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's an institutional challenge, and we have, it's easier to answer it in relation to how do you scale up within a country from local to national, for instance. And one of the models that we have is the formation of federations. So for instance, this has been particularly successful when we look at self-help groups. So you have, for instance, are some of you familiar with self-help groups? Yes? So if you have self-help groups, you suppose that forms the base, and you can have several self-help groups in a range of villages. And then you draw it up like a pyramid. So you have representatives at the district level, and then you have block level, district level, and then you can go up to the national level. You can find federations of self-help groups at the state level. For instance, Andhra Pradesh in India is a very good example. But a national level federation can also be found, and that's in Nepal. It's the one country in the world where you have from absolutely local groups protecting a national federation, and they have elections. It's done very democratically, and they have been very successful. Women are built into the constitution 50% of office bearers. And what is very interesting is that this FECOFAN, the Federation of Forest User Groups in Nepal, was able to intervene when the state brought in policies for commercial logging, for instance, in particular areas, and they could resist that. They also played a part of the democracy movement. So in fact, the implications of this were much more than just dealing with forestry, although it was a forestry federation. So I do think that form, it is possible to do that within countries. The dialogue across countries is of course much more complicated. You have representatives of countries coming up in recent years who may not even listen to you. So that, I think, is a big challenge. Yeah.
And I think the challenge for transnational feminist networking is a really big problem.
Well, the way I see it is not just feminist networking, because one of the sad points of the gender and environment thing is that you don't have a large body of it's not taken up by the women's movement in most countries. And I'm really I use the term gender progressive groups, whether it's looking at agriculture or in, when I was doing my work on land rights. And it wasn't supported by many women's groups, but it was supported by people who were gender progressive and mixed gender groups who were working on livelihood issues at the grassroots level. So I think we have many more contenders, people who can join the long march. So
Good. Well, I'm going to hand over to John now, because I think there's some themes there that he might also pick up in a different context.
Thanks, Melissa, and thank you, Bina. It's a rare privilege and opportunity to sit here and have a conversation with you and reflect on those 3 volumes. I have had the good fortune of being able to go through them prior to the meeting, unlike the audience, but I certainly encourage you to, if you get the opportunity, please take a chance and do review the material. I'm coming at this not as an economist, but as a geographer who spent most of the last 3 decades working around agricultural science and technology issues, and much of that time working in Africa, although I've spent and worked in different parts of Asia. Among other things, I've been serving for the last decade as coordinator of the Future Agricultures Consortium, which works on the political economy of agricultural policy in Africa, working with partners across the region there. In the last year, we've had the great fortune of securing a new 5-year program with funding from the UK Department for International Development called APRA, Agricultural Policy Research in Africa. Now, the focus of that has been framed by DFID. And the overarching question that we're attempting to address through this is, what are the pathways to agricultural commercialization that are most effective in empowering women and girls, reducing rural poverty, and improving food and nutrition security in sub-Saharan Africa? So it's about empowerment, poverty reduction, and food and nutrition security. You've addressed these sorts of issues over many years, particularly in Volume 1, but also picked up on elements of the other 2. And just wondering, we were starting the conversation before we came in here when you were saying, well, what do you mean by commercialization? And I'd like you perhaps to help us to think about this as we start to design this research going forward, to think about those commercialization pathways that really can empower women and improve food security and reduce poverty based on your own understandings and perspective.
Well, it's a very complicated question because you've used terms like commercialization, Then there's food security, there's nutrition security, not the same thing. Then you've also talked about empowerment. So it's, you shouldn't listen to Diffid so much. But you have to untangle all of this. So you've got your work cut out for 5 years if it's a 5-year project. Firstly, as you know, there was a long-standing, I think, myth that women produce food crops and men produce cash crops. Well, in countries like India, food crops are also cash crops in the sense that you sell rice, you eat rice, you sell wheat, you eat wheat. But yes, there's cotton and there's cocoa and there's many other cash crops which are not food crops. This dichotomy that women are food croppers has long been, it really, if anybody holds it, please divest yourself of that idea. Because of course we know that women don't only produce food crops, nor should they be only producing food crops. And in large parts of Africa, from what I know of sub-Saharan Africa, also parts of South Asia, you find that women farmers are also good at producing cash crops. So in 1988, I lived for 2 weeks in a village in Rajasthan, and I just spent my days just talking to the farmers and men and women farmers. So this one woman farmer, she was a widow, she had 1 acre of land, and she called me over and said, can you do some sums for me? I said, okay. So in the back of my notebook, she told me how much she was spending and what she was getting, and she was growing onions. And she said, am I doing the right thing? Because people here are not particularly growing onions. And I did a calculation, and she was making a profit. And I said, you're doing absolutely the right thing. Now, just note, she had control over the land, she had control over the decisions on what she could grow in land. She was a widow, so, okay, she could negotiate her own space. Maybe she had a son, and Michael and I were talking, the likelihood of a woman inheriting was much greater if she had a son, but a minor son. What I'm saying is that commercialization can empower women if they can take advantage of commercial outlets, value chains, new markets. And that requires them to have access both to the assets and inputs and new technologies, as well as, ability to negotiate in the markets. Now, of course, a very important question is, and food security, as we know, is not necessarily dependent on whether we grow food crops. After all, you and I are not growing food crops, and we're perfectly food secure. So we need to broaden that definition. And some NGOs still hold that they insist that, in my current work in Andhra Pradesh, I'm working with, I'm studying women's groups who are collectively farming, and many of them stopped and asked them why, and they said, well, we were told to grow food crops. This is a semi-arid area, and if we'd grown cotton, it would have been much more successful. So we need to move out of that. But if women do have, the path from commercial to empowerment, it seems to me it depends very much on whether they are riding on the commercial benefits rather than being the victims of that. That's one more challenge I think exists here. I'm hoping I can persuade people after my current research is done that we tend to think of farmers as either individual family farmers, women alone or with their families, and perhaps cooperation could be an answer. So for instance, that picture you saw of women using a patida, now that's a small women's group, and they are in a district where they're doing vegetable farming, and they are able to negotiate prices. They're able to hold off and say, we're going to harvest at this time when the prices of bananas are really high. So if given the chance, they can actually make profits. However, the same set of women were individualized with small, very small farms with very little access to anything, no crop insurance. You have a drought and you fall into debt. Does that?
Yeah. I'd like to pick up on that last point because that's a question that I had that also you touched on in your talk, and it's in the first volume, which is different from a lot of the collective action discussions in volume 3, which relate to natural resource issues and common pool resource management. You were talking about essentially organizing for the markets, of organizing women into farmer groups of different sorts, or as you also talked about federations. The challenge that I see in the African context is there was a big push in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s to organize farmer cooperatives of different forms and even organize federations. But you gave a wonderful example of Nepal, but Nepal is always the reference point for federations. We look at the context of Africa, there are few and far between that are functioning successfully, particularly when it comes to negotiating with and accessing the market. And I'm wondering, what are the critical elements of success? How do you not only organize, but sustain these groups to be effective? I know even in the international context, the International Federation of Agricultural Producers, IFAC, collapsed. It couldn't be sustained over the long term. And so is there a difference between organizing for collective action for natural resources, resource management, and organizing to cooperate to compete in this very difficult market in agriculture?
Thank you. Well, as always, you asked a really complex question. So I have to actually untangle this. Okay, so I'll untangle it by referring to two elements. Firstly, an argument which constantly comes back to me, so it's a great opportunity to share with you what my answer is. And this is that people, well, you know economic theory, where the standard assumption was that of course people will free ride, so they will not cooperate. And because we assume that the most important motivation of human behavior is self-interest. Now there's a huge literature coming out within economics also which says that self-interest is not the only motivating point, and so on. So we have a history of attempts at cooperation. We're talking about cooperation, not collectivization, so we put aside the whole history of socialist collectivization, which is top-down and so on and so forth, and coercive. And post-colonialism, if you like, as countries in the 50s and 60s in Africa and Asia became independent of colonial rule, among many institutional experiments they tried was the experiment of cooperative farming. And if you look at some of the early literature of unrest, if we go back to the 1970s, there's a whole series of studies looking at cooperation. They didn't succeed. And today we know enough about cooperative theories of cooperation to understand why they didn't succeed. You can't have small farmers and large farmers in Punjab and the entire community coming together and saying, well, you cooperate. So we know that the basic principle that there should be some degree of homogeneity, there should be small groups, and it should be bottom-up and voluntary. Those principles were never even in the picture in the 50s and 60s. So that's the first. And today we do see examples of farmers cooperating. And we have many examples of people cooperating around common pool resources. Now, Ellen Ostrom, of course, brought this to the fore. She took examples from irrigation, from forestry, from many parts of the world, not just Nepal, but also in the United States and so on. And she did inductive theory building. And there were a lot of papers, but there was her particular book, Governing the Commons, 1990, was very influential in removing this myth that people can't cooperate. Okay, and you have lots of communities today. My book, Gender and Green Governance, there were, at the time when I was studying this, there were 84,000 community forestry groups in India, and there were 10,000 in Nepal. So we have, this is just forestry, then there's examples from irrigation and so on. So people have cooperated under common pool resources. We still have a question mark about can people cooperate as farmers? And why is there a difference? The difference is that I think the labor process is very different. So if you're protecting a forest, you set up a patrol group, you set up a set of rules, and that's all you do. Whereas if you're farming, you have to take a lot of risks together. You pull your land, you make decisions on what you grow, you make sure that everybody turns up for work. There could be absenteeism and so on. There could be a crop loss, so people have to agree that they're going to share the losses. There could be profits, so there have to be decisions about sharing. So there's a whole range of decisions from obtaining the land to harvesting to marketing, which is required if you pool in agriculture. In between, you have a lot of cooperation just for marketing. So you have a spectrum of cooperation. You have a lot of cooperation in marketing. Dairy marketing goes back in Europe several hundred years. Switzerland, Denmark, Netherlands, India, Amul, which is about 3 million very poor people who are members of cooperatives. Marketing doesn't require cooperation. A cooperative around marketing does not require you to cooperate. Cooperation around common pool resources requires a degree of cooperation. Cooperation around farming requires hugely integrated cooperation. So, as I said, I feel that if it is possible to come up with examples and answers, it could be a breakthrough between the very small family farms, which are often not viable anymore, less than 2 hectares. 80% of farms in South Asia are less than 2 hectares, many of them in sub-Saharan Africa. And the very large corporate farms which people are promoting. Can there be an in-between model, which is that 3 of us have an acre each and we pull it together and we're 3 acres. And so we own little, but we have a middle range farm for economies of scale and so on. Okay, so finally, I'm studying this. So just wait for the results in the next lecture. I'm studying this in South Asia, in India, in France, in Romania. And if you come across in your research any examples, please write to me.
And I think an emerging collaborative agenda between your work, Bina, and the APRA program in Africa is
oh, I switched off the mic. I hope you can still hear me.
Yes.
Is kind of taking shape before our eyes. But listen, I mean, that was fascinating. We've got about 15 minutes in which I'd now like to open up to the floor. For any of you who would like to pose a question or a comment on the basis of what Bina said, or perhaps her writings if you're familiar with them. So I'll perhaps take a group of about 3 and let Bina come back, and then we'll see if we've got a time for one more round. So please shout. Okay, Michael.
Bina, thank you very much for coming and for sharing this extremely impressive body of work with us. It's wonderful to have you back. Please don't go off to Manchester again, stay. We need you around. 2 issues. You have a number of data sets where women are in various ways performing better productively than men. But what do you say to the possible point, and that is precisely because women have in the past been discriminated against. As they come out of the undergrowth, fight successfully against being discriminated against, so you are bringing into production a whole lot of people who are likely to be better at it than the people who have it easy all the time. But this is a very important but essentially temporary effect of ending discrimination against women, rather than something special about gender. And my second question is about your work on cooperation in farming, which you've described very interestingly. And it's really a flip side of what you say, which is, why are you so worried about the prospects of the people with 1 hectare or half a hectare or a quarter of a hectare? Not only are there many hundreds of millions of them, but they are doing very nicely, thank you, on the whole, in spite of discrimination against them in many ways. And in fact, as you know, the median size of farm is getting smaller in many countries. Land is moving out of large into smaller farms, even in China, despite various local government corruption against it. And you've generally got a scene where people are voting with their feet in favour of smaller scale farming. So while completely accepting all you say about the validity of service cooperatives, given the great difficulty of observing cooperative action and successful collective action in field management itself, what is wrong with more equal ownership, including more equal gender ownership, small-scale farming in developing countries with plenty of labour?
Great, okay, 2 pretty hard-hitting questions there. I'm going to take another couple, so Bina, if you can make a note of what people are asking. So, who else would like to weigh in here? Come on, I can't believe the silence on the stage. the challenge.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, just Sophie, just behind you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Melissa.
Might be too basic a question, but what
You speak louder.
might be too basic a question, but what was the link that you found between land ownership with women and domestic violence? How did that link
That's a great question. So let's take one more if anyone else has got. Yeah, Andrew.
Look, I'm an energy obsessive, as you know. I have two things. One is a statement that the rural electrification in the United States was driven in the 1920s and today by cooperatives, and it is driven by gendered end uses, which is an amazing and surprising phenomenon. I'm just wondering whether we're talking a lot about energy access at the moment, whether it is clear what a gendered energy access would actually look like, and whether this is actually analytically a useful way of approaching it.
Okay. Great. So, Bina, have a go at some of those, and we can be, if we're relatively brief, we can then
Okay.
have time for a few more.
All right, okay. There's a great, with questions comes collaboration. Michael, you always ask difficult questions. Okay. Actually, you don't find that women are doing better than men. So for instance, FAO's assessment was based on 27 studies. They can be qualitative. These are quantitative studies with large data sets. And I actually summarized these studies in one of the papers in volume 1. And they found that 3 sorts of results. In some instances, and most of these studies were based in Africa, it's much easier to study and compare in Africa because of the fact that women might have their individual plots and also have work with men on family plots, whereas as you know, as well as all of us, that in Asia, you have a single family plot and men and women work on that, typically. So the data that FAO, by the way, puts out as proportion of women who own land and men who own land is actually only about female and male-headed households. In case any of you are planning to look at it, don't get deceived by that. It doesn't tell you how much is owned within the household.
And the productivity is higher.
The FAO data set. So, but apropos your question, so you found that in some cases, women's productivity was lower than men's, but when you adjusted for input use, then you found that they were as productive, with the answer that they were as efficient as men if they had access to the same inputs. In some instances, they were more productive, and in some cases, there was not very much difference. I think my general proposition that women tend to be disadvantaged in access to land and input markets stands, and it also stands that if you are able to overcome that through state support, then you're likely to move in a positive direction by increased productivity. I mean, the very simple proposition that, when Chris Udre's work, when he talks about shifting fertilizers from the men's fields to the women's fields, I mean, it's really, I was just thinking it's a simple marginal productivity curve. In the downward part of the curve, you shift, inputs from there, and you shift it to the upward rising part of the curve in women's fields, and it will happen. There are women who are empowered enough to come out and fight for their rights, if you like. But you don't find that enough. So if you look at ownership of assets, the huge disadvantages and inequalities that you see means that it is not enough that people are motivated individually and they come out, and that will change the picture. So what I'm saying is that state support, civil society support, and the individual motivation, all of that matter. Now, there may be subtext to your question, which we'll take up later over dinner. The second question is about cooperation in farming. Now, Michael, you're a skeptic about collective action around and cooperation around farms. That I understand. But then you suggest that what is wrong with small-scale farming? There's nothing wrong with small-scale farming. The question is, how small can you get? So it seems to me there are two elements to this. One is that some of the farms are so small that, there's this work by Rosenweig and Binswanger, I think, which they try and see what is the minimum, at least the minimum amount of land. I think as I remember, it was about 5 acres. But if most of now, we can discuss what the methodology was and so on, but the point is that you can be very small economically, and you can be even smaller in terms of your voice politically. So when I talk about cooperation, I think the way I see it is that it improves not just in terms of economies of scale, but it also has an opportunity to increase your voice and bargaining power. So there's a dual effect. That's possible. And so I remain still an optimist. And I would, as I said, the results I have so far for Kerala show that the women's groups, and these are groups of relatively homogeneous, 4 or 5 women, up to 10 women maximum, belonging to neighborhood groups. And their yields of major crops and the profits are higher when I compare them to individual farmers in the same regions. So I think the institutional element is still an important one which we shouldn't be ignoring. That is the structure of production. Sophie, your question, it's a good question. You've seen the results. Women are more protected from domestic violence if they have land. What is the process? Now, there could be several processes. One element is that if you have an immovable property like land or a house, you have within the bargaining theory, you have a credible threat. If you simply have employment, you've got 3 kids, you can't go, it's not credible that you're going to walk out in the middle of the night and find an alternative. But if a woman who has, say, an alternative to go to as a house or land, then it is a credible threat that yes, I will walk out. And I have another table where I show who leaves, who quits if they do face violence, a certain proportion despite owning property, and do they come back. And most of the women who face violence, who leave and they have property, don't come back. So they have a real exit option. The other is, one would imagine that the men are also, the husbands are also interested in having some benefits from the property. And that would also act as a deterrent. Andrew, that's very interesting. I don't think it was so much a question, but you're saying what does a gendered access look like? Well, for a start, gendered access to energy would mean that these, 60% of, the women, what was the figure? Very high, 1.6 million or 6 million, I forget. Anyway, the very high levels of mortality when you're using unprocessed biofuels, which includes firewood, crop waste, and so on, it would be a hugely positive health outcome. I would suggest that if you're using technology, you would agree with me, it needs to be adapted. So something as simple as improved stoves. If you're a poor household, you don't want 2 holes in that stove. One is enough because that's the only, the rice and the dal and so on that you're going to cook. If you're a bigger household, you may need more holes. You talk to the women what the purpose of that technology is. So in cold huts and barren slopes, as you remember, I provided a chapter with an alternative. And this was an experiment that was done by Madhu Serene, where in Haryana, she went and she worked with the women. She's an architect by training, and the stoves were built with women's help, with local material, and they decorated it, and it at the very high adoption stage. So if you went to those households, the men showed you the tractors, and the women took you to the kitchens and showed you their improved stoves. Whereas in many other cases, you had stoves in the kitchens, but then most women were not using them. So I think there are many dimensions which are very gendered in issues. Brief second round.
we'll take one more question, and I'm going to let Rafi ask, because I know you've been waiting. So one more briefly, and then I think we'll have to finish. Okay, and one half. So two quick questions, try and keep them brief.
Even brief there, but a quick comment and then a question. I'm glad you've got red there, because it should be in accordance with national laws and the theories of Karl Marx. So here's my question. Have you thought about these issues in the context of value chains, and in particular global value chains? Because much of the discussion is really around the production part of the chain. But we know that that is a very small component, particularly in global value chains, of the build-up and the accretion of value and the appropriation of value.
Very good question. And then the final one, Sophie, just behind you there.
Hello, my name is Ikshita. My question is that you've mentioned that access to resources often has a positive impact on empowerment. But this has not been very true in the case of the microcredit program in Bangladesh. And secondly, in context of India, we also find this issue of water wise in Maharashtra, where women are often used as a medium to get access to water. These men, they are marrying multiple women and to only get access to water in villages. So, I mean, how access to resources is actually related to empowerment.
Great. So two, again, large questions, which being I
Brilliant.
ask you to be very brief on, because we're pretty much out of time.
I think the issue of connecting women to value chains is women who have commercial crops to value chains is very important. And you would have a better answer to that in terms of what's happening on the ground since you worked on it. I think it's happening, but you require, like for instance, using of cell phones to find out what the market prices are. It's happening with SEVA, in Self-Employed Women's Association, because they are using global networks to do that. A large number of women are not. So, and my understanding is that it can be a mixed bag. You know, the degree to which you're connected with global value chains. Because if you're just you're producing something, not crops, but suppose you're producing in the garment industry, if you're producing something in your own home, then you can be hugely exploited as well. So the conditions under which you engage with value chains is very important. I've always said that it's very important to talk about immovable assets. So land and housing has a very different connotation from simply having access to microcredit. There are other difficulties with microcredit. Suppose you were to think that the women would use the microcredit for a joint enterprise. Now that's a different proposition from simply getting credit, and we know there's leakages. I mean, in the Bangladesh case also, the husbands take advantage of the women. And in the second example also you said that husbands can take advantage of that. So there's no such thing as an automatic arrow. Access to resources leads to empowerment. My argument would be that the process of acquiring access to assets, especially movable assets, itself will be empowering. So if you have a movement to have control over various sorts of resources, then through that movement you will be empowered. And that's only the starting point, because with land you also have to have access with water and with inputs.
So, Bina, participants, thank you. I mean, that was a rich conversation. It's a rich set of volumes. I'd encourage you all to read them, to engage with the work. And all I'd like to say in conclusion is may the conversation continue. We've had a long history of work together. There are clearly many, many questions that we're all interested in. And let's keep the conversation going. So one more thanks to Bina.
Thank you.